Today, let's examine what happens behind the scenes when you reserve resources in GENI. All GENI resource reservation tools use the same data formats and APIs. These are the Resource Specification, or RSpec, and the GENI Aggregate Manager, or AM API. A researcher interacts with the GENI Federation using a tool. GENI has a clearinghouse, which is responsible for managing users, projects, and slices. Aggregates are the software that makes resources available to users. The researcher uses clearinghouse APIs to speak to the clearinghouse. For example, her tool will request a new slice on her behalf, and the clearinghouse will return a slice credential. In turn, her tool uses the Aggregate Manager API, or AM API, to request resources from the aggregate. For example, it passes the slice credential and carefully formatted request RSpec to the aggregate, and the aggregate replies in kind. Let's examine this process in more detail. GENI resource specifications, or RSpecs, are plain XML documents that describe resources. For example, this is a complete RSpec for a single node with one interface. The green text indicates this is an RSpec, in fact it is a request RSpec. The blue text describes the node, and the orange text indicates the single interface on the node. There are three flavors of RSpec: advertisements, requests, and manifests. Aggregates use advertisements to describe the resources they have available. Experimenters use requests to describe the resources they want. And aggregates use manifests to inform experimenters what resources were actually allocated to them. Experimenters' tools and the aggregates pass these RSpecs back and forth to each other using the Aggregate Manager API, or AM API. For example, the experimenter's tool will ask the aggregate what resources are available using the list resources command. The aggregate will return an advertisement RSpec specifying what resources are available. The experimenter will then select the desired resources, and their tool will describe those resources using a request RSpec, which is passed to the aggregate using a create sliver call. The aggregate will either accept or reject that request. If it accepts the request, the aggregate will return a manifest RSpec. The manifest is very similar to the request, but more fleshed out. For example, the manifest will contain login information and more details, such as IP addresses, that may not have been in the request. A little while later, the experimenter may have forgotten what resources she had, so she makes another list resources call, this time specifying a slice, to find out what resources she has. The aggregate will reply with a new copy of the manifest. Since all GENI resource reservation tools speak the AM API and RSpec, you should pick the tool that works best for you and your current situation.